so dark.
You can turn on that light. You want to do that? We're live.
Hey, everybody.
You want to turn on the overhead light?
Yeah.
Hello. Hello, Redeemer. We're going to think about, now, yeah. That's
okay.
there. Maybe it readjusted. Yeah.
We're glad to be joining y'all.
Yeah, we're excited. We really don't have any idea what this could look like. But we both love the idea of reading a really good book together with the church. And there's a part of me actually that really wishes that that school had kind of taken this whole year off to read really good literature. So we'll see how it goes. We'll read. And
yeah.
The book we're reading is.
So we're reading The Hiding Place. This is written by Corrie Ten Boom, and along with John and Elizabeth Sherrill. And depending on what version you have, paper or electronic, there's various editions that have different forewords, different folks who kind of offer their feedback at the beginning. I think that, we are reading, we love stories, right? Because
we're living in the greatest one, right?
Right.
We were created for that.
Yeah, and we have a God who gave us the Bible. It's full of stories, and He knows that's part of the fabric of who we are. Is that we're caught up in His story, and that we learn from each other's stories, that we share. We like sharing ours with other people. We like to hear others because we can connect with different parts, and we can learn from things we've never heard before.
We're actually in a story that could get interrupted, right?
Yeah, there might be a baby.
David's upstairs yelling, but we don't want to waste any time either. And
I think maybe we should pray.
Pray?
Yeah.
That's always good. The best story, right?
Yeah.
We should pray to the best author.
Yes.
So, yeah. Dear Lord, gosh, we're humbled, Lord. We're thankful for story. We are living in one. We read of your goodness in this great story that begins with "Let there be light." And Lord, we pray that for all of us hearing and all of us who might hear this later, that we might see light by really your pursuit displayed in this story. So help us as we see what you entered, Lord. We also get to see a picture of, wow, you didn't enter, you didn't wait for the world to get good to come into it, Lord. You came to save a pretty wretched place. And by saving it, you give us the power to believe that you are present in it. So help us hear that in this story as Corrie writes of her life and you in it, you in her life, and in the life that actually preceded hers in her family. So we pray that for everyone, Lord, tonight listening, for us as we read and enjoy words on a page. And help us to see you in those words. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
I'll be clear really quick. I don't mean to imply that this is anything like gospel. I don't want to go into that space, but this is really, you've taught this way more. So you tell me about it. Right? Becky's read this like 100 times.
Well, So I did teach 8th graders for 7 years, and we taught, looking into the camera, we're getting used to all the technology, so I've read this a number of times, and it's a story I've never ever gotten tired of. And every time I open the pages, there's something else that's being breathed to life. And I think that it's important to know. So, if parents, if you haven't read this before, um, then it's helpful to know that the story is not totally linear. Corrie writes and does some flashbacks. She starts in one spot and then jumps back to her childhood and then hops forward to later in her life. So just keep that in mind. It can be a little bit confusing as she's doing that. There are some really great resources out there that offer timelines of what happens. There's a website, and we can get all these resources to you in the next week or so, just so you can kind of follow along. And it might be, we might even stop in points to try to just to ask questions or to address something that's going on. But it does take place in the Holocaust, during the era. That is the main time period. And so if you have children, I think it's beautiful if you're involving them in this. It'd probably be good to just give a little bit of background about that, just briefly, whatever you feel is age appropriate for them. But I had taught on the Holocaust for 8 years of my teaching career, and had never heard of this book and had not read it. And there aren't a whole lot of really bright, glowing, hopeful books about the Holocaust. And this, I wouldn't say this is one either, but there is a really, really beautiful living hope that is present in this book in a way that is not fabricated. It's not cheesy. It's not trying to make us feel good. And in no way, I think that like we can read this and I can think Corrie Ten Boom is just the most amazing woman in the whole world. I want to be like her. She's my hero. And I am pretty sure that's the last thing that Corrie Ten Boom would want us to get out of this book. She is a woman who's writing in her 70s, and looking back on her life with the perspective of a woman who can see what the Lord has done in ways that most of us can't see in the moment. And so just keep that in mind. Don't start comparing yourself to anybody and thinking, I wish I should be more like her. Now, it's a great way to be inspired, of course, and we can pray the Lord help us in the ways where we are living and growing. But just to know that, and parents, maybe even we were talking about how it might be good for you to share with your kids or your spouse or a friend about a time when you were in a really dark and hard place and couldn't see the way out, and 10 or 20 or 30 years later, you're understanding that the Lord was working things for good somehow, even if it's not all complete and neat and tidy. So this is a story of our God and his faithfulness in the darkest of times. And that's what we hope. Yeah. We see more and more.
I'm going to start actually reading the preface, which is in your book. And I'll try and get through that quickly. We're planning on 2 chapters tonight. So
we'll see how that goes.
We better shut our mouths. Picking us to read this.
Yeah.
We might go, we could go late.
If you have either of our numbers, feel free to text us and just be like, move along.
Wait, don't do that. I don't know what's going on. I can't see the chat though, so I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I'll turn it on.
We'll figure that out next time.
I got it. Yeah.
But the preface starts. In May 1968, I spent several days at a retreat center in Darmstadt, Germany, at a time when most Germans preferred not to think about the Holocaust or even denied outright that it had happened. A group of Lutheran women calling themselves Sisters of Mary took on themselves the task of repentance for their nation. They assisted Jewish survivors, listened to their stories, and publicized the truth about the Nazi past. While at the center, I attended an evening service featuring 2 speakers. The first was a man who had been a prisoner in a concentration camp. He had been brutalized and starved. His father and brother had died in the camp. The man's face and body told the story more eloquently than his words. Pain-haunted eyes, shaking hands that could not forget. He was followed at the lectern by a white-haired woman, broad of frame and sensible of shoe. Comfortable shoes. What a thing to note. With a face that radiated love, peace, and joy. But the story that these two people related was the same. She too had been in a concentration camp, experienced the same savagery, suffered identical losses. The man's response was easy to understand. But hers? At the close of the service, I stayed behind to talk with her. Cornelia Ten Boom. It was apparent had found in a concentration camp, as the prophet Isaiah foretold, a hiding place from the wind and a covert from the tempest, the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. It's Isaiah 32:2. With my husband John, I returned to Europe to get to know this amazing woman. Together, we actually visited the little Dutch house, one room wide, where until her 50s, she lived the uneventful life of a spinster watchmaker. And a spinster basically means that she had decided she wasn't going to get married and have children. Little dreaming, as she cared for her older sister and their elderly father, that a world of high adventure and deadly danger lay just around the corner. We went to the garden in southern Holland, where young Corrie gave her heart away forever, to the big brick house in Haarlem, where Pickwick served real coffee in the middle of the war. And all the while, we had the extraordinary feeling that we were looking not into the past, but into the future, as though these people and places were speaking to us not about things that had already happened, but about the experiences that lay ahead of us. Already, we found ourselves putting into practice what we learned from her about the following, like handling separation, getting along with less, security in the midst of insecurity, forgiveness, how God can use weakness, dealing with difficult people, facing death, loving your enemies, what to do when evil wins. We commented to Corrie about the practicalness of the things she recalled, how her memories seemed to throw a spotlight on problems and decisions we faced here and now. But, she said, this is what the past is for. Every experience God gives us, every person he puts in our lives is the perfect preparation for a future that only he can see. Every experience, every person, father, who did the finest watch repairs in Holland and then forgot to send the bill. Mama, whose body became a prison, but whose spirit soared free. Betsy, who could make a party out of 3 potatoes and some twice-used tea leaves. As we looked into the twinkling blue eyes of this undefeatable woman, we wished that these people had been part of our own lives. And then, of course, we realized that they could be. And this is by Elizabeth Sherrill. It's the lead-in because these two folks are the ones who helped her write this book, to put her story to page. So we should start.
Yes.
You want to start?
Okay. Chapter 1. The 100th birthday party. I jumped out of bed that morning with one question in my mind: sun or fog? Usually it was fog in January in Holland, dank, chill, and gray. But occasionally, on a rare and magic day, a white winter sun broke through. I leaned as far as I could from the single window in my bedroom. It was always hard to see the sky from the bayou. Going to pause there briefly. Don't worry, not every 3 sentences, but
Wait.
So most of your books hopefully have a picture of the actual house. That's what they call the house, the bayou, B-E-J-E. So
that's the picture that you're looking at.
And
most of them are in the books.
Yeah.
But we can send that out too.
And it's helpful. I will say, as many times I've read this, every time I read it and look at the map more, it helps me understand more what actually they're discussing. And it will be important to know how the house is designed. But know that the bayou, it's not the BGs. The BG is the bayou. That's where they live. So blank brick walls looked back at me, the backs of other ancient buildings in this crowded center of old Haarlem, the city in which she lives, the town in Holland. But up there, where my neck craned to see above the crazy roofs and crooked chimney, was a square of pale pearl sky. It was going to be a sunny day for the party. I attempted a little waltz as I took my new dress from the tipsy old wardrobe against the wall. Father's bedroom was directly under mine, but at 77, he slept soundly. There was one advantage to growing old, I thought, and I worked my arms into the sleeves and surveyed the effect in the mirror on the wardrobe door. Although some Dutch women in 1937 were wearing their skirts knee-length, mine was still a cautious 3 inches above my shoes. You're not growing younger yourself, I reminded my reflection. Maybe it was the new dress that made me look more critically at myself than usual. 45 years old, unmarried, waistline long since vanished. I just love her writing.
Yeah. And she's writing about 1937.
Yes.
That's this year.
So 1937. My sister Betsy, though 7 years older than I, still had that slender grace that made people turn and look after her in the street. Heaven knows it wasn't her clothes. Our little watch shop had never made much money. But when Betsy put on a dress, something wonderful happened to it. On me, until Betsy caught up with them, hems sagged, stockings tore, and collars twisted. But today, I thought, standing back from the mirror as far as I could in the small room, the effect of dark maroon was very smart. Far below me, down on the street, the doorbell rang. Callers before 7 in the morning? I opened my bedroom door and plunged down the steep, twisting stairway. These stairs were an afterthought in this curious old house. Actually, it was 2 houses. The one in front was a typical tiny old Harlem structure, 3 stories high, 2 rooms deep, and only 1 room wide. At some unknown point in its long history, its rear wall had been knocked through to join it with the even thinner, steeper house in back of it, which had only 3 rooms, one on top of the other, and this narrow corkscrew staircase squeezed between the 2. Cook as I was, Betsy was at the door ahead of me. An enormous spray of flowers filled the doorway. As Betsy took them, a small delivery boy appeared. "Nice day for the party, miss," he said, trying to peer past the flowers as though coffee and cake might already be set out. He would be coming to the party later, as indeed it seemed would all of Harlem. Betsy and I searched the bouquet for the card. "Pickwick," we shouted together. Pickwick was an enormously wealthy customer who not only brought the very finest watches, but often came upstairs to the family part of the house above the shop. His real name was Herman Slurring. Pickwick was the name Betsy and I used between ourselves because he looked so incredibly like the illustrator's drawing in our copy of Dickens. Herman Slurring was without doubt the ugliest man in Harlem. Short, immensely fat, head bald as a Holland cheese, he was so wall-eyed that you were never quite sure whether he was looking at you or someone else, and as kind and generous as he was fearsome to look at. The flowers had come to the side door, the door the family used, opening onto a tiny alleyway, and Betsy and I carried them from the little hall into the shop. First was the workroom where watches and clocks were repaired. There was the high bench over which Father had bent for so many years, doing the delicate, painstaking work that was known as the finest in Holland. And there in the center of the room was my bench, and next to mine, Hans the apprentice's, and against the wall, old Christophel's. Beyond the workroom was the customer's part of the shop with its glass case full of watches. All the wall clocks were striking 7, as Betsy and I carried the flowers in and looked for the most artistic spot to put them. Ever since childhood, I'd loved to step into this room where 100 ticking voices welcomed me. This is not something we know these days, right?
No,
like most of us wear a watch, maybe digitally on a wrist, on a cell phone.
Yeah.
This is my watch, right? So yeah, fun to imagine. It was still dark inside because the shutters had not been drawn back from the windows in the street. I unlocked the street door and stepped out into the Barteljorenstraat.
The what?
Pay attention to the last part of that word, the street.
Yeah,
the street.
it is the street. Barteljorenstraat.
The other shops up and down the narrow street were shuttered and silent. The opticians next door, the dress shop, the bakers, Wiles Furriers across the street. The furrier.
The furrier.
They're furrier.
Which we don't have those anymore either, do we?
Yeah.
So that's the name of the street where all the shops were.
Yeah. And it's heart of Harlem. I folded back our shutters and stood for a minute admiring the window display that Betsy and I had at last agreed upon. This window was always a great source of debate between us, I wanting to display as much of our stock as could be squeezed onto the shelf, and Betsy maintaining that 2 or 3 beautiful watches, with perhaps a piece of silk or satin swirled beneath, was more elegant and more inviting. But
Betsy was the artist.
Yes. Right. But this time the window satisfied us both. It held a collection of clocks and pocket watches, all at least 100 years old, borrowed for the occasion from friends and antique dealers all over the city. For today was the shop's 100th birthday. It was on this day in January 1837 that Father's father had placed in this window a sign, Ten Boom, watches. For the last 10 minutes, with a heavenly disregard for the precisions of passing time, the church bells of Harlem had been pealing out 7 o'clock, and now half a block away in the town square, the great bell of St. Bobbo's solemnly donged 7 times.
Which they're later than his, right?
Right.
So it's kind of neat how she comes back to that.
Yeah.
Time.
I lingered in the street to count them, though it was cold in the January dawn. Of course, everyone in Harlem had radios now, but I could remember when the life of the city had run on St. Bobbo time, and only trainmen and others who needed to know the exact hour had come here to read the astronomical clock. Father would take the train to Amsterdam each week and bring back the time from the Naval Observatory, and it was a source of pride to him that the astronomical clock was never more than 2 seconds off in the 7 days.
Yeah.
There it stood now as I stepped back into the shop, still tall and gleaming on its concrete block, but shorn now of eminence. The doorbell in the alley was ringing again, more flowers. So it went for an hour, large bouquets and small ones, elaborate set pieces and homegrown plants and clay pots. But although the party was for the shop, the affection of a city was for Father. Harlem's grand old man, they called him, and they were setting about to prove it. When the shop and the workroom would not hold another bouquet, Betsy and I started carrying them upstairs to the 2 rooms above the shop. Though it was 20 years since her death, these were still Tante Jan's rooms, or Jan's rooms. So Tante is the word for aunt or aunt.
Mm-hmm. I saw her talking on Corrie Ten Boom. You can see some interviews with her. Mm-hmm. She just calls her own.
So Tante Jan's was mother's older sister, and her presence lingered in the massive dark furniture she had left behind her. Betsy set down a pot of greenhouse-grown tulips and stepped back with a little cry of pleasure. Corrie, just look how much brighter. Poor Betsy. The Bay was so closed in by the houses around that the window plants she started each spring never grew tall enough to bloom. We're getting a picture of Betsy and Corrie's little differences quickly. At 7:45, Hans, the apprentice, arrived, and at 8, Toos, our sales lady bookkeeper. Toos was a sour-faced, scowling individual whose ill temper had made it impossible for her to keep a job until 10 years ago she had come to work for Father. Father's gentle courtesy had disarmed and mellowed her, and though she would have died sooner than admit it, she loved him as fiercely as she disliked the rest of the world. We left Hans and Toos to answer the doorbell and went upstairs to get breakfast. Only 3 places at the table, I thought, as I set out the plates. The dining room was in the house at the rear, 5 stops higher than the shop, but lower than Tante Jan's rooms. To me, this room, with its single window looking into the alley, was the heart of the home. This table, with a blanket thrown over it, had made me a tent or a pirate's cove when I was small. I'd done my homework here as a school child. Here Mama read aloud from Dickens on winter evenings, while the coal whistled in the brick hearth and cast a red glow over the tile, proclaiming, Jesus is victor. We used only a corner of the table now, Father, Betsy, and I, but to me the rest of the family was always there. There was Mama's chair and the 3 aunts' places over there. Not only Tante Jan's, but Mama's other 2 sisters had also lived with us. Next to me had sat my other sister, Nolly, and Willem, the only boy in the family, there beside Father. Nolly and Willem had had homes of their own many years now, and Mama and the aunts were dead, but still I seemed to see them here. Of course, their chairs hadn't stayed empty long. Father could never bear a house without children, and whenever he heard of a child in need of a home, a new face would appear at the table. Somehow, out of his watch shop that never made money, he fed and dressed and cared for 11 more children after his own 4 were grown. But now these 2 had grown up and married or gone off to work, and so I laid 3 plates on the table. Betsy brought the coffee in from the tiny kitchen, which was little more than a closet off the dining room, and took bread from the drawer in the sideboard. She was setting them on the table when we heard Father's step coming down the staircase. He went a little slowly down the winding stairs, but still as punctual as one of his own watches. He entered the dining room, as he had every morning since I could remember, at 8:10.
Exactly.
That's kind of how our house functions.
No,
This is inspiring.
Know it's 8:10. Yeah. Be inspired by that.
Yeah.
Be inspired. We barely made it to this at 8 o'clock.
Father, I said, kissing him and savoring the aroma of cigars that always clung to his long beard. A sunny day for the party. Father's hair and beard were now as white as the best tablecloth Betsy had laid for this special day. But his blue eyes behind the thick round spectacles were as mild and merry as ever, and he gazed from one of us to the other with frank delight. Corrie, dear, my dear Betsy, how gay and lovely you both look. He bowed his head as he sat down, said the blessing of her bread, and then went on eagerly. Your mother, how she would have loved these new styles and seen you both looking so pretty. Betsy and I looked hard into our coffee to keep from laughing. These new styles were the despair of our young nieces, who were always trying to get us into brighter colors, shorter skirts, and lower necklines. But conservative though we were, it was true that Mama had never had anything even as bright as my deep maroon dress or Betsy's dark blue one. In Mama's day, married women and unmarried ones of a certain age wore black from the chin to the ground. I had never seen Mama and the aunts in any other color. But how Mama would have loved everything about today, Betsy said. Remember how she loved occasions? Mama could have coffee in the stove and a cake in the oven as fast as most people could say best wishes. And since she knew almost everyone in Harlem, especially the poor, sick, and neglected, there was almost no day in the year that was not for somebody, as she would say with eyes shining, a very special occasion. And so we sat over our coffee as one should on anniversaries and looked back to the time when Mama was alive and beyond, back to the time when Father was a small boy growing up in the same house. I was born right in this room, he said, as though that he had not told us 100 times. Only, of course, it wasn't the dining room, but a bedroom, and the bed was in a kind of cupboard set into the wall with no windows and no light or air of any kind. I was the first baby who lived. I don't know how many there were before me, but they all died. Mother had tuberculosis, you see, and they didn't know about contaminated air or keeping babies away from sick people.
What a crazy time.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm first time reading that, thinking that he doesn't even know how many times Mom had a baby. They all died. Like he was the first one. It's just amazing. In 37. I mean, that's not that long ago.
It was a day for memories, a day for calling up the past. How could we have guessed, as we sat there, 2 middle-aged spinsters and an old man, that in place of memories, we were about to be given adventure such as we had never dreamed of. Adventure and anguish, horror and heaven were just around the corner, and we did not know.
Yeah.
Whew. Oh, Father, Betsy, if I had known what had gone ahead, could I have done the things I did? But how could I know? How could I imagine this white-haired man called Opa, grandfather, by all the children of Harlem? How could I imagine this man thrown by strangers into a grave without a name? And Betsy, with her high-lace collar and her gift for making beauty all around her, how could I picture this dearest person on earth to me standing naked before a room full of men? In that room, on that day, such thoughts were not even thinkable. Father stood up and took the big brass-hinged Bible from its shelf as Toos and Hans rapped on the door and came in. Scripture reading at 8:30 each morning for all who were in the house was another of the fixed points around which life in the Bayeux revolved. Father opened the big volume, and Betsy and I held our breaths. What if we did that every time the Bible was open? Held our breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good exercise.
We'll start.
We'll try. Surely, today of all days, when there was still so much to do, it would not be a whole chapter. But he was turning to the Gospel of Luke, where we left off yesterday. Such long chapters in Luke, too. With his finger in place, Father looked up. Didn't we do Luke just a few years ago?
We did.
Took a long time.
Where's Christophel? He said.
You should pick up, because I think we might only get through a chapter.
Well, we're going to try. Christophel was the third and only other employee in the shop. A bent, wizened little man who looked older than Father, though he actually was 10 years younger. I remembered the day 6 or 7 years earlier when he had first come into the shop, so ragged and woebegone that I'd assumed he was one of the beggars who had the Bayeux marked as a sure meal. And he would have been right. I was about to send him up to the kitchen where Betsy kept a pot of soup simmering when he announced with great dignity that he was considering permanent employment and was offering his services to us first. It turned out that Christophels belonged to an almost vanished trade. Certainly vanished now.
Right.
The itinerant clockmender who trudged on foot throughout the land, regulating and repairing the tall pendulum clocks that were the pride of every Dutch farmhouse. But if I was surprised at the grand manner of this shabby little man, I was even more astonished when Father hired him on the spot. They're the finest clockmen anywhere, he told me later, these wandering clocksmiths. There's not a repair job they haven't handled with just the tools in their sack. And so it had proved through the years as people from all over Haarlem brought their clocks to him. What he did with his wages, we never knew. He remained as tattered and threadbare as ever. Father hinted as much as he dared, for next to his shabbiness, Christophel's most notable quality was his pride. And then gave it up. And now, for the first time ever, Christophel's was late. Father polished his glasses with his napkin and started to read, his deep voice lingering lovingly over the words. He had reached the bottom of the page when we heard Christophel shuffling the steps on the stairs. The door opened and all of us gasped. Christophel was resplendent in a new black suit, new checkered vest, a snowy white shirt, flowered tie, and stiff starched collar. I tore my eyes from the spectacle as swiftly as I could, for Christophel's expression forbade us to notice anything out of the ordinary. He wanted just to show up like that. What? Do I have something in my teeth? No. Christophel's, my dear associate, Father murmured in his formal, old-fashioned way. What joy to see you on this auspicious day. And hastily he resumed his Bible reading. Before he reached the end of the chapter, the doorbells were ringing, both the shop bell on the street and the family bell in the alley. Betsy ran to make more coffee and put her tarts in the oven, while Toos and I hurried to the doors. It seemed that everyone in Haarlem wanted to be first to shake Father's hand. Before long, a steady stream of guests was winding up the narrow staircase to Tante Jan's rooms, where he sat almost lost in a thicket of flowers. I was helping one of the older guests up the steep stairs when Betsy seized my arms. Corrie, we're going to need Nolly's cups right away. How can we? I'll go get them. Our sister Nolly and her husband were coming that afternoon as soon as their 6 children got home from school. I dashed down the stairs, took my coat and my bicycle from inside the alley door, and was wheeling it over the threshold when Betsy's voice reached me, soft but firm. Corrie, your new dress. I just picture like, she already said, what, she's 45. She's getting ready to get on her bicycle to ride over to her sister's house. It is a lovely picture. We should do that more.
Yeah.
Bicycles to church from now on. That's all. And so I whirled back up the stairs to my room, changed into my oldest skirt, and set out over the bumpy brick streets. I always loved to bike to Nolly's house. She and her husband lived about 1.5 miles from the Bay, outside the cramped old center of the city. The streets there were broader and straighter. Even the sky seemed bigger. Across the town square I pedaled, over the canal on the Groot Hout Bridge and along the Wagenweg, reveling in the thin winter sunshine. Bet you could find all those places on a map.
Yeah.
Nolly lived on Bos en Hohenstraat, a block of identical attached houses with white curtains and potted plants in the windows. How could I foresee, as I zipped around a corner that one summer day, when the hyacinths in the commercial bulb flats nearby were ripe and brown, I would break my bicycle here and stand with my heart thudding in my throat, daring to go no closer for fear of what was taking place behind Nolly's starched curtains. Today, I careened onto the sidewalk and burst through the door with never a knock. Nolly, the Bay's jammed already. You ought to see. We need the cups right now. Nolly came out of the kitchen, her round, pretty face flushed with baking. They're all packed by the door. Oh, I wish I could go back with you, but I've got batches of cookies still to bake, and I promised Flip and the children I'd wait for them. You're all coming, aren't you? All of you? Yes. Corrie Peter will be there. Nolly was loading the cups into the bicycle bags. As a dutiful aunt, I tried to love all my nieces and nephews equally, but Peter, well, was Peter. At 13, he was a musical prodigy and a rascal and the pride of my life. He's even written a special song in honor of the day, Nolly said. Here now, you'll have to carry this bagful in your hand, so be careful. The Bay was more crowded than ever when I got back. The alley so jammed with bicycles, I had to leave mine at the corner. The mayor of Harlem was there in his tailcoat and gold watch chain, and the postman and the trolley motorman and 6 policemen from the Harlem police headquarters just around the corner. After lunch, the children started coming, and as children did, they went straight to Father. The older ones sat on the floor around him. The smallest ones climbed into his lap. For in addition to his twinkling eyes and long cigar-sweet beard, Father ticked. Watches lying on a shelf run differently from watches carried about. And so Father always wore the ones he was regulating. His suit jackets had 4 huge inside pockets, and each of them had hooks for 12 watches. That'd be so funny. So that wherever he went, the hum of hundreds of little wheels went gaily with him. Now, with a child on each knee and 10 more crowded close, he drew from another pocket his heavy cross-shaped winding key. Each of the 4 ends were shaped for a different size clock. With a flick of his finger, he made it spin, gleaming and glinting. Kind of like one of those, what do they call them?
Fidget spinners?
The fidget spinners, yeah. Grandpa had all those kids hypnotized. Betsy stopped in the doorway with a tray of cakes. He doesn't know there's anyone else in the room, she said.
Oh.
I was carrying a stack of soiled plates down the stairs when a little shriek below me told me that Pickwick had arrived. We used to forget, we who loved him, what a shock the first sight of him could be to a stranger. I hurried down the door, introduced him hastily to the wife of an Amsterdam wholesaler, and got him upstairs. He sank in his ponderous bulk into a chair beside Father, fixed one eye on me, the other on the ceiling, and said, 5 lumps, please. Poor Pickwick. He loved children as much as Father did. But while children took to Father on sight, Pickwick had to win them. He had one trick, though, that never failed. I brought him his cup of coffee, thick with sugar, and watched him look around in mock consternation. But my dear Cornelia, he cried, there's no table to set it on. He glanced out of one wide-set eye to make sure the children were watching. Well, it's a lucky thing I brought my own. And with that, he set the cup and saucer on his own protruding paunch. I had never known a child who could resist it. Soon, a respectful circle had gathered around him, too. A little later, Nolly and her family arrived. Taunt Corrie, Peter greeted me innocently. You don't look 100 years old. I That could go over well with some people.
Right.
Don't say that to your mom. No.
No.
Wait. And before I could swat him, he was sitting on Tante Jan's upright piano, filling the old house with melody. People called out requests, popular songs, selection from Bach chorales, hymns, and soon the whole room was joining in the choruses. How many of us were there that happy afternoon who were soon to meet under very different circumstances? Peter, the policeman, dear ugly Pickwick, all of us were there, except my brother Willem and his family. I wondered why they should be so late. Willem and his wife and children lived in the town of Hilversum, 30 miles away. Still, they should have been here by now. Suddenly the music stopped, and Peter, from his perch on the piano bench, hissed across the room, "Opa! Here's the competition!" I glanced out the window, turning into the alley where Mr. and Mrs. Kahn, owners of the other watch shop on the street. By Harlem standards, they were newcomers, having opened their store only in 1910. And so had been on the Bartel Jorisstraat a mere 27 years. But since they sold a good many more watches than we did, I considered Peter's comment factual enough. Father, however, was distressed. "Not competition, Peter," he said reprovingly. "Colleagues." And lifting children quickly off his knees, he got up and hurried to the head of the stairs to greet the Kahns. Father treated Mr. Kahn's frequent visits to the shop below as social calls from a cherished friend. "Can't you see what he is doing?" I would rage after Mr. Kahn had gone. "He's finding out how much we're charging so he can undersell us." Mr. Kahn's display window always featured in bold figures prices exactly 5 guilders below our own. And Father's face would light up with a kind of pleased surprise that it always did on those rare occasions when he thought about the business side of watchmaking. "But Corrie, people will save money when they buy from him." And then he would always add, "I wonder how he does it." Father was as innocent of the business know-how as his father had been before him. He would work for days on a difficult repair problem and then forget to send the bill. The more rare and expensive a watch, the less he was able to think of it in terms of money. "A man should pay for the privilege of working on such a watch," he would say. Maybe he had like a different currency. I think he did, and that's kind of what he's teaching Corrie.
Yeah.
As for merchandising methods, for the first 80 years of the shop's history, the shutters on the streets had been closed each evening around 6 o'clock. It was not until I myself had come into the business 20 years ago that I had noticed the throngs of strollers crowding the narrow sidewalks each evening, and had seen how the other stores kept their windows lighted and open. When I pointed this out to Father, he was delighted, as though I had made a profound discovery. "And if people see the watches, it might make them want to buy one." "Corrie, my dear, how clever you are." I think there's got to be, at least for us and me as a father, some nostalgia in her writing here. I guess he never spanked her. Mr. Kahn was making his way toward me now, full of cake and compliments. Guilty for the jealous thoughts I harbored, I took advantage of the crowd and made my escape downstairs. The workroom and shop were even more crowded with well-wishers than the upstairs rooms. Hans was passing cakes in the back room, as was Tooze in the front, wearing the nearest thing to a smile that her perpetually drawn-down lips would permit. As for Christoffels, he had simply and astonishingly expanded. It was impossible to recognize that stooped and shabby little man in the glorious figure at the door, greeting newcomers with a formal welcome, followed by a relentless tour of the shop. Quite obviously, it was the greatest day of his life. All through the short winter afternoon, they kept coming. The people who counted themselves Father's friends, young and old, poor and rich, scholarly gentlemen, and illiterate servant girls. Only to Father did it seem that they were all alike. That was Father's secret. Not that he overlooked the differences in people, that he didn't know they were there. And still, Willem was not there, was not here. I said goodbye to some guests at the door and stood for a moment gazing up and down the Bartel Jorisstraat. Although it was only 4 in the afternoon, the lights in the shops were coming on against the January dusk. I still had a great deal of little sister worship for this big brother, 5 years older than I, an ordained minister, and the only Ten Boom who had ever been to college. William saw things I felt. He knew what was going on in the world. Oftentimes, indeed, I wished that William did not see quite so well, for much that he saw was frightening. A full 10 years ago, way back in 1927, William had written in his doctoral thesis, done in Germany, that a terrible evil was taking root in that land. Right at the university, he said, seeds were being planted of a contempt for human life, such as the world had never seen. The few who had read his paper had laughed. Now, of course, well, people weren't laughing about Germany. Most of the good clocks came from there, and recently several firms with whom we had dealt for years were simply and mysteriously out of business. William believed it was part of a deliberate and large-scale move against Jews. Every one of the closed businesses was Jewish. As head of the Dutch Reformed Church's program to reach Jews, William kept in touch with these things. Dear William, I thought as I stepped back inside and closed the door. He was about as good a salesman of the church as Father was of watches. If he'd converted a single Jew in 20 years, I hadn't heard about it. William didn't try to change people, just to serve them. He had scrimped and saved enough money to build a home for elderly Jews in Hilversum, for the elderly of all faiths, in fact, for William was against any system of segregation. But in the last few months, the home had been deluged with younger arrivals, all Jews and all from Germany. William and his family had given up their own living quarters and were sleeping in a corridor. And still the frightened homeless people kept coming, and with them, tales of a mounting madness. I went up to the kitchen where Nolly had just brewed a fresh pot of coffee, picked it up, and continued with it upstairs to Tante Jan's rooms. What does he want? I asked a group of men gathered around the cake table as I set down the pot. This man in Germany, does he want war? I knew it was a poor talk for a party, but somehow thoughts of William always set my mind on hard subjects. A chill of silence fell over the table and spread swiftly around the room. What does it matter? A voice broke into it. Let the big countries fight it out. It won't affect us. That's right, from a watch salesman. The Germans let us alone in the Great War. It's to their advantage to keep us neutral.
And the Great War, just for any kids, was World War I. Yeah.
Easy for you to talk, cried a man from whom we bought clock parts. Your stock comes from Switzerland. What about us? What do I do if Germany goes to war? A war could put me out of business. And at that moment, William entered the room. Behind him came Tine, his wife, and their 4 children. But every eye in the room had settled on the figure whose arm William held in his. It was a Jew in his early 30s in the typical broad-brimmed hat and long black coat. What glued every eye to this man was his face. It had been burned. In front of his right ear dangled a gray and frazzled ringlet, like the hair of a very old man. The rest of his beard was gone, leaving only a raw and gaping wound. This is Herr Gutlieber, William announced in German. He just arrived in Hilversum this morning. Herr Gutlieber, my father. He got out of Germany on a milk truck, William told us rapidly in Dutch. They stopped him on a street corner, teenage boys in Munich, and set fire to his beard. Father had risen from his chair and was eagerly shaking the newcomer's hand. I brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of Nolly's cookies. How grateful I was now for Father's insistence that his children speak German and English almost as soon as Dutch. Wish my father had been that insistent. Herr Gutlieber sat down stiffly on the edge of a chair and fixed his eyes on the cup in his lap. I pulled up a chair beside him and talked some nonsense about the unusual January weather, and around us conversation began again, a hum of party talk rising and falling. Hoodlums, I heard the watch salesman say. Young hooligans. It's the same in every country. The police will catch up with them. You'll see. Germany's a civilized country. And so the shadow fell across us that winter afternoon in 1937. But it rested lightly. Nobody dreamed that this tiny cloud would grow until it blocked out the sky. And nobody dreamed that in this darkness, each of us would be called to play a role. Father and Betsy and Mr. Kahn and Willem, even the funny old Beyer with its unmatching floor levels and ancient angles. In the evening, after the last guest had gone, I climbed the stairs to my room, thinking only of the past. On my bed lay the new maroon dress. I had forgotten to put it back on. I never did care about clothes, I thought, even when I was young. Childhood scenes rushed back at me out of the night, strangely close and urgent. Today I know that such memories are the key, not to the past, but to the future. I know that the experiences of our lives, when we let God use them, become the mysterious and perfect preparation for the work He will give us to do. I didn't know that then, nor indeed that there was any new future to prepare for in a life as humdrum and predictable as mine. I only knew, as I lay in my bed at the top of the house, that certain moments from long ago stood out in focus against the blur of years. Oddly sharp and near they were, as though they were not yet finished, as though they had something more to say. So we've been going for 50 minutes. Sorry for the early preface. And the goal was to try and get through chapter 2.
Should we start into it?
We can start into chapter 2, and we'll find a stopping place.
Yeah. And we were struck, or I know we talked about that part you just read, about the past and the way that she's framing that. So maybe just something, if you're talking about this with your small group or whoever you might be looking at the camera, other people that you might be discussing it with. We tend to often do two things with the past. We either tend to have a lot of nostalgia that we revel in, or we tend to lament over really
I wish I'd done
difficult
this different.
things, right? A lot of regret and sadness. And it's not wrong to be sad. It's not wrong to have warm memories, but it's great how she frames this. So there is a different purpose, that it actually is God laying foundation for our lives. And so something to kind of think on as we continue reading.
Yeah.
Full table. Do we just love her house? I mean, I want to hang out there, right?
Yeah. There's great online, you can see it virtually.
Yeah. So. Shall I begin? Okay.
Sure.
All right. So now we're going back in time, right? It was 1898, and I was 6 years old. Betsy stood me in front of the wardrobe mirror and gave me a lecture. Just look at your shoes. You've missed every other button. And those old torn stockings your very first day at school. See how nice Nolly looks. Nolly and I shared the bedroom at the top of the Beyer. I looked at my 8-year-old sister. Sure enough, her high-buttoned shoes were neatly fastened. Reluctantly, I pulled off mine while Betsy rummaged in the wardrobe. At 13, Betsy seemed almost an adult to me. Of course, Betsy had always seemed older because she couldn't run and roughhouse the way other children did. Betsy had been born with pernicious anemia. And so, while the rest of us played tag or bowled the hoop or had skate races down frozen canals in winter, Betsy sat and did dull grown-up things like embroidery. But Nolly played as hard as anyone and wasn't much older than I, and it didn't seem fair that she should always do everything right. Betsy, she was saying earnestly, I'm not going to wear that great ugly hat to school just because Tante Jans paid for it. Last year was that ugly gray one. And this year it's even worse. Betsy looked at her sympathetically. Well, but you can't go to school without a hat, and we can't afford another one. We don't have to. With an anxious glance at the door, Nolly dropped to her knees, reached beneath the single bed, which was all our tiny room would hold, and drew out a little round hat box. Inside nestled the smallest hat I had ever seen. It was of fur, with a blue satin ribbon for under the chin. Oh, the darling thing! Betsy lifted it reverently from the box. and held it up to the patch of light that struggled into the room over the surrounding rooftops. Where did you ever? Mrs. Van Diver gave it to me. The Van Divers owned the millinery shop 2 doors down. She saw me looking at it, and later she brought it here after Tante Jans picked out that. Nolly pointed to the top of the wardrobe. A deep-brimmed brown bonnet with a cluster of lavender velvet roses proclaimed in every line the personage who had picked it out. Tante Jans, Mama's older sister, had moved in with us when her husband died to spend, as she put it, what few days remained to me, though she was still only in her early 40s. Her coming had greatly complicated life in the old house, already crowded by the earlier arrivals of Mama's other two sisters, Tante Bep and Tante Yana, since along with Tante Jans had come quantities of furniture, all of it too large for the little rooms of the Bayet. For her own use, Tante Jans took the 2 second-story rooms of the front house directly over the watch shop and workroom. In the first room, she wrote the flaming Christian tracts for which she was known all over Holland, and in the second, received the well-to-do ladies who supported this work. Tante Jans believed that our welfare and the hereafter depended on how much we would accomplish here on earth. For sleep, she partitioned off a cubicle from her writing room just large enough to hold a bed. Death, she often said, was waiting to snatch her from her work, and so she kept her hours of repose as brief and businesslike as possible. I could not remember life in the Bayet before Tante Jans' arrival, nor whose those 2 rooms had been before. Above them was a narrow attic beneath the steep sloping roof of the first house. For as long as I could recall, the space had been divided into 4 truly miniature rooms. The first one, looking out over the Bartle Drawer Strat, and the only one with a real window, was Tante Bep's. Behind it, strung like railroad compartments off a narrow aisle, were Tante Anna's, Betsy's, and our brother Willem's. 5 steps up from those rooms, in the second house behind, was Nolly's and my small room. Beneath ours, Mama's and Father's room, and beneath theirs, the dining room, with the kitchen tacked like an afterthought to the side of it. If Tante Jans' share in this crowded house was remarkably large, it never seemed so to any of us living there. The world just naturally made place for Tante Jans. All day long, the horse-drawn trolley clopped and clanged past our house to stop at the Grote Market, the central town square half a block away. At least that was where it stopped for other people. When Tante Jans wished to go somewhere, she stationed herself on the sidewalk directly in front of the watch shop door, and as the horses thundered close, held up a single gloved finger. It looked to me more possible to stop the sun in the sky than to halt the charge of that trolley before its appointed place. But it stopped for Tante Jans. Brakes squealing, horses nearly falling over one another, and the driver tipped his tall hat as she swept aboard. And this was the commanding eye past which Nolly had to get the little fur hat. Tante Jans had bought most of the clothing for us 3 girls since coming to live with us, but her gifts had a price. To Tante Jans, the clothes and fashion when she was young represented God's final say on human apparel. All change since then came from the style book of the devil. Indeed, one of her best-known pamphlets exposed him as the inventor of the mutton sleeve and the bicycle skirt.
You even know what those are? What's a mutton sleeve?
I know. We need to look this up.
Bicycle skirt. Must have been short.
Yeah. I know. I said now as the button hook and Betsy's swift fingers sped up my shoes. Another item we don't see a lot of, button hooks. But you could fit the fur hat right inside the bonnet. Then when you get outside, take the bonnet off. Corrie, Nolly was genuinely shocked. That wouldn't be honest. And with a baleful glance at the big brown hat, she picked up the little fur one and started after Betsy round the stairs down to breakfast.
Maybe we should stop there.
Yeah. I mean, y'all have to wonder what's going to happen with the hat. Is she going to get to wear it?
I mean, we'd probably read, all night, but want to be respectful of folks' time and whatnot. It's coming up on the whole hour.
Yes.
Maybe we'll read faster next time, or
I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, it is. Thanks for joining us.
Yes.
It is, as you've seen, a lovely book. Hopefully we're helping folks dive in.
Feel free to read ahead and feel free to reach out, and we're open to questions or ideas if you want more talking and less reading, or more reading and less talking. Or, we're enjoying ourselves, but we want you to also.
Yeah.
So, thanks, y'all. Peace.
Are we sure we want to end the stream? I think so.